Fire, the mystic. Fire, the thunderbird. Fire of Hephaestus and of Bast. Fire of many gods, partner to brimstone, byword of the devil. Fire, destructor of all things. Such was the ancients' understanding of fire.
Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a love story framed around looking. It shows us how it feels to look and be looked at, to fall in love and to have love fade into memory. The film tells a story that radically redefines the gaze, and embedded within this exploration of looking is the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. This myth both centers the story in the past and transforms the present. The film is set in 18th century France and follows Marianne, a painter, who is invited to an isolated aristocratic household in Brittany to paint a portrait of Eloise. Eloise is newly betrothed to a Milanese nobleman whom she has never met, and she is unhappy with the prospect of her marriage. So, in way of rebellion, she is refusing to pose for her portrait and managed to exhaust the first painter who tried. So, when Marianne is brought to Eloise, she is introduced to her as her walking companion. Marianne must paint Eloise in secret, using fleeting memories to patch together a portrait. The two women slowly form a connection, and this connection blooms into love. Their love story mimics the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which becomes an explicit metaphor for their relationship just over halfway through the film, when Eloise, Marianne, and the serving girl Sophie read and discuss Ovid's version of Orpheus's journey to and from the underworld and his failure to save Eurydice. Siama has said that the idea of including this myth came to her late in the script writing process, but when it came to her, it was an epiphany. She initially included it because she wanted a scene where the characters would have an intellectual debate with each other, but as this idea grew in her mind, it became the key to tying the two threads of the narrative together. The first thread being Marianne in the present, reflecting on her love affair with Eloise, and the second thread being the past, in which Eloise and Marianne met, bonded, and fell in love. In fact, the relationship of Eloise and Marianne does not just mimic that of Orpheus and Eurydice, it reinvents it. In the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, to turn and look can be the same as to kill. In his Metamorphosis, Ovid writes, Orpheus turned, and at once Eurydice sank back into the dark. She died for a second time. To put it simply, looking is dangerous. Siama says one of the reasons that she chose this myth was because it is the myth of the male gaze and how the male gaze kills. In Portrait of a Lady on Fire, the look or the gaze is first harnessed to tell the story. In the beginning, Marianne steals glances at Eloise, trying to commit her features to memory so that she can complete the portrait in secret. Eloise stares back at her, defiant, but their looks lack coordination. When Eloise looks at Marianne, Marianne turns away. There is a sense that it is forbidden. In a way it is. Eloise has rejected being looked at. By refusing to pose for the previous painter, she has rejected objectification, and when she finds out that Marianne has been painting her in secret all this time, she feels betrayed.
Vous me voyez comme ça?
So, here, as in the myth, looking is equated with danger, and gives possibilities of betrayal and violation. Marianne must learn to truly see Eloise before she can capture her likeness in paint. The male gaze was a term first coined by film critic Laura Mulvey in her seminal essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Her theory is that viewers of media are assumed to be heterosexual men, and so a heterosexual masculine perspective is imposed on female characters. Mulvey writes, "In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between the active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female form, which is styled accordingly." This idea of the active male and passive female is not just seen in film, but in all visual culture and literature. In Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus is active as he leads Eurydice out of the underworld, and he is active when he turns back to look at her. Eurydice remains passive and obedient. In Ovid's telling of the myth, she is not even angry that Orpheus turned. What could she complain of, except that he'd loved her? It is pertinent that Siama uses the classical myth of Orpheus and Eurydice as a tool for reframing the gaze. This is because, in the past, classical mythology has been used not as a tool for the liberation of women, but as a tool for their objectification. We have, for example, the classical statues of men and women to compare. Crouching Aphrodite shows the goddess Aphrodite bathing herself. This could be portrayed as a fairly mundane task. Bathing is, after all, a routine activity. But instead, there is an implied male viewer. Aphrodite looks upwards with a surprised expression and uses her arms to protect her modesty, creating a sense of shame around female nudity. And yet, her arms do not obscure the viewer's gaze as her breasts are still visible, so her protective gesture does more to draw attention to her nakedness than to deter it. Compare this to Discobolos, another Greek sculpture, but this time of a man. The differences are stark. The man depicted is nude, yet no attention is drawn to his nudity. It is not questioned by the viewer or shamed, it is just accepted. He is in the dynamic pose of a discus thrower, showing the clear divide of the active male, passive female. The man is in motion, whilst Aphrodite, the woman, is the static object of an active male gaze. In the Renaissance period and beyond, the male gaze remains omnipresent, especially in paintings depicting scenes from classical mythology. For these artists, antiquity represented an exotic, pagan existence, one exempted from the moral restrictions of their Christian society. In short, classical mythology became an opportunity and excuse to paint nude women. This can be seen in Peter Paul Rubens' 1636 painting The Judgment of Paris. Rubens uses his classical setting as an opportunity to paint the female nude through the goddesses Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera. This is an especially attractive moment of Greek mythology for male artists because the goddesses are showing themselves off to Paris in the hopes of being proclaimed the most beautiful. He even goes as far to paint the woman from 3 different angles so that the female form can be enjoyed from multiple perspectives. We can see Athena straight on, Aphrodite from the side, and Hera from behind. Whilst all the artworks mentioned are undoubtedly masterpieces in terms of composition, style, and execution, their implications cannot be ignored. As art critic John Berger puts it, in these artworks, women are there to feed an appetite, not to have any appetite of their own. And this appetite feeds the male gaze. With Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Siama wages a war against the male gaze, calling the film a manifesto for the female gaze, and does so by subverting the traditions of how women are depicted in relation to classical mythology. She removes the heterosexual male perspective by writing a story about lesbian love, thus removing notions of gender domination. Then she breaks the imbalance between the active artist and the passive muse. The film presents to us an artist-muse relationship. Marianne is the artist and Eloise becomes her muse, again echoing the artist-muse relationship of Orpheus and Eurydice. Marianne takes the role of Orpheus. She is highly skilled in painting, as Orpheus is highly skilled in music. From the start of the story, she is portrayed as being active, confident, and assertive. She jumps into the sea without hesitation to retrieve her art equipment when it falls overboard. When she arrives at Eloise's household, she finds herself a meal without asking for permission. Orpheus too is highly assertive in his request to Hades to bring back Eurydice from death. But more importantly, Marianne symbolizes Orpheus because she will eventually have to make a choice as to whether to be with her lover or to let her live as a memory, just as Orpheus made the choice whether to turn and look at Eurydice or whether to save her. Eloise's story, on the other hand, parallels Eurydice's. She is being taken away against her will to an unwanted marriage away from the woman that she truly loves, just as Eurydice is taken by death away from Orpheus. For Eloise, marriage might as well be death. She frequently talks in disgust of her fate, refusing to believe that she will find any joy in marriage.
Je dis juste qu'il y aura aussi de bonnes choses. Vous dites surtout que de temps en temps, je serai consolée.
In fact, the man who Eloise is engaged with was first engaged to Eloise's sister, who killed herself to escape marriage. It is no wonder that Eloise sees marriage as a form of death. There is an energy and an intensity to an artist-muse relationship that makes it all the more captivating to watch. But there is also an imbalance. The imbalance comes back to ideas of passive versus active. The artist is active as he styles the passive muse in whatever way he envisions her. However, Siama refuses the idea that the artist is the one with the power. She has said that with the film, she wanted to get rid of the idea of the muse. The muse is a fetishized, silent woman who's inspiring just because she's beautiful. Siama's erasure of the muse is beautifully conveyed in the scene where Eloise poses for Marianne. At this point in the film, Eloise knows that Marianne is a painter and has agreed to sit for her portrait. This already gives Eloise more equality. Marianne is no longer painting her secretly, and now Eloise can begin to have a say in how she is portrayed.
Et puis c'est un sentiment doux à vivre, l'égalité.
But equality can also be disconcerting for those that previously held the power. At first, the camera shows Marianne. The frame is close up, and she is comfortably at her easel. When we see Eloise, we see her from Marianne's perspective, posing for the painting in a wider shot. Marianne smugly lists Eloise's little habits that she has noticed from her position as the viewer. Eloise rubs her chin when she is hurt. She bites her lips when she is embarrassed. She doesn't blink when she is annoyed.
Pardonnez-moi, je n'aimerais pas être à votre place. Mais nous sommes à la même place. Exactement à la même place.
The camera slowly pans in on Eloise until it comes to the same close position that we saw Marianne in before.
Si vous me regardez, qui je regarde moi?
Then, to prove her point, she lists Marianne's habits. When you don't know what to say, you touch your forehead. When you lose control, you raise your eyebrows. And when you're troubled, you breathe through your mouth. When the camera switches back to Marianne at her easel, the shot is wide and it is framed from Eloise's perspective. Marianne is clearly taken aback by the idea that she is being looked at. This revelation removes her comfort in being the artist, and she realizes that the muse is not passive. Eloise has been actively looking back at her this whole time. As one review puts it, Eloise reveals that the currents of observation flow in both directions. This is the first subversion of the Orpheus myth. Eurydice too can choose to look. Orpheus and Eurydice are first explicitly mentioned just over halfway through the film. Marianne, Eloise and Sophie sit around a table, and then Eloise reads aloud the chapter of Ovid's Metamorphosis that recounts Orpheus persuading Hades to let him save Eurydice, and then Orpheus making the fatal decision to turn and look before she was safely back in the overworld. Marianne and Sophie sit enraptured by Eloise's passionate narration. The tension of the story is palpable. Will Orpheus convince the gods? Will Eurydice be saved?
C'est horrible. La pauvre, pourquoi s'est-il retourné? On lui a dit de ne pas se retourner et au dernier moment il se retourne sans raison.
Here, Sophie sees directly into the enigma of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. Why did Orpheus turn? He was warned not to. He had everything to lose by turning and nothing to gain. And yet he did turn. Marianne's interpretation tries to reconcile this paradox.
Peut-être que s'il se retourne, c'est qu'il fait un choix. Quel choix? Il choisit le souvenir d'Eurydice. C'est pour ça qu'il se retourne. Il ne fait pas le choix de l'amoureux, il fait le choix du poète.
Peut-être que c'est elle qui lui a dit. Retourne-toi.
When Marianne and Eloise must part ways, they, like Orpheus, make the poet's choice. For them, the poet's choice is more realistic. Their relationship can be allowed to live on as a memory, where it would not be allowed to continue in a world that is built against them. In their last few days together, they discuss what they will remember about each other. At Eloise's request, she opens Ovid's Metamorphosis and draws a self-portrait inside for Eloise to keep. This drawing, done on page 28, the end of Orpheus's chapter, becomes a secret symbol of their relationship. When later in life Marianne comes across a portrait of Eloise, she smiles to see that whilst Eloise is depicted with a daughter, she is also holding a book, her thumb opening it on page 28. This is a symbol of all the queer women throughout history. We might not know their stories, but that does not mean they didn't exist. Just as to the unknowing viewer, this portrait is just of a mother and her daughter, but to Marianne it is a message of love and desire. The reenactment of the myth is brought to an end in their goodbye scene.
Retourne-toi.
The main body of the film focuses on Eloise and Marianne's relationship as it unfolds, but this story is framed as being in the past. In fact, the film opens with Marianne seeing an old painting of Eloise. The painting triggers memories of the past, and the audience is taken through the story of them meeting. We are shown that Marianne is haunted by her memories of Eloise. In two separate scenes, we see Marianne walking through the dark. Eloise appears behind her in her glowing wedding dress, looking just as she did in their parting scene. Each time Marianne turns around, only to see Eloise fade into darkness, just as Eurydice fell back into the abyss. Clearly, the poet's choice is not an easy option. Memories can be sweet, but they can also be painful. After we see their farewell scene, we are taken back to Marianne's near present. We see her in an exhibition, standing by her own painting, which depicts the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. The illusions are clear. Eurydice wears a bright white dress, mirroring Eloise's wedding dress, and Orpheus wears a blue robe, the same blue that Marianne is wearing as she stands in front of the painting. The cliffy background evokes the coastal setting of Brittany where their love affair took place.
On a tendance à le représenter avant qu'il ne se retourne, ou après, quand Eurydice meurt. Chez vous, on dirait qu'il se salue.
This line shows that Siama is aware that she is reinventing the myth, making it new. In an interview she said, "It's about reinventing and revisiting the myth, and from a feminine perspective." And so, Siama's subversion lies in her vision of an empowered Eurydice through Eloise. In Siama's version, Eurydice has agency. She takes control of her fate and refuses to be passive. Any preconceived ideas of the Muse are eroded. Eloise is an artistic collaborator, not an object, just as Eurydice becomes an active part of Orpheus's story through Marianne, Eloise and Sophie's commentary on the myth. Siama confronts the male gaze that permeates through classical reception, creating a story that focuses on a female queer gaze, using mythology as a tool to show new perspectives.